So I want to talk about overpopulation, and I know it's something I've talked about a lot already, but I think I have a few more things to say. Now, I don't want to preach to the converted here. The thing is, like, there are certain things that I think certain people just aren't budging on, like man-made global warming and resource depletion, like oil, peak oil, and stuff like that. Like, I think there are some people who refuse to believe in these things, no matter how much evidence you show them. It's kind of like the inverse of like leftists and liberals when it comes to like race or gender. How they won't believe in obvious realities no matter how much you show them. But I think there's a lot of other arguments too about overpopulation and why it's just objectively a bad thing. Now, the first thing is okay, I think it's a general principle with a lot of things that you cannot increase quantity without sacrificing quality. You see it with like mass produced goods and how it just declines in quality compared to things that are more handcrafted. Like, take food, for instance. Like, the more mass produced it becomes, generally the quality is reduced. Even with restaurants, like, as certain restaurants expand more, there's less quality control over how delicious the food is, and it becomes this kind of like standardized slop because there's just a lack of quality control because there's too many locations. Like, you see this with a lot of these mega chains as they expanded and the quality of the food decreased. So it's the same thing with people. The more people there are, I think, the more quality of life diminishes for each person simply because there's just too many people. Um, Now, there's some ways in which this is obviously measurable. Take, for instance, overcrowding. Like, a lot of right wingers talk about how they don't want to live in overcrowded places. But the thing is, land is a non renewable resource. Even if you somehow believe that oil magically replenishes itself, land sure as hell doesn't. And there's no way that you can have a world of 10 billion or 20 billion people and still have people living in these, like, in the countryside, and still somehow having untouched forests and national parks and things like that. It's just not possible. Like, when you have too many people on the planet, either A, all the nature becomes at least semi-developed, or B, you have to crowd everyone into these super crowded cities in order to avoid spoiling all the nature. So again, that's another reason, just sheer overcrowding. And you can see this in various things. Like, for instance, like over tourism. You see it in, like, the more people there are on the planet, just because there's more people doesn't mean there's suddenly another Hagia Sophia, another St. Peter's Basilica. It doesn't really work that way. You can't really create another Grand Canyon or another Niagara Falls. I mean, China's tried to create these like fake versions, but they obviously look like an inferior copy, much inferior. So yeah, I mean, you have more people, but more people wanting to still go to the same places. So you have this overcrowding occurring in terms of tourist destinations, and that's just something we see across the globe. Another example is transportation. Once you get to have a certain number of people in a certain area, there's no way that the roads and the public transit won't become overcrowded. It's just not feasible. Like, past a certain point, there is no way to not have constant traffic congestion. It's simply impossible from a logistic perspective, no matter how hard you try. I mean, even Japan, which is like one of the most efficient and technologically advanced countries in the world, they still can't stop this problem entirely. They have people who are hired to push people onto subway trains because the subway trains get so crowded. I mean, I saw it in Istanbul with the trams there. Like, some of these trams were so ridiculously crowded. I tried to get into one and I couldn't because it was just so packed. I had to wait for the next one. So again, with overpopulation, we see this on a global scale. Again, like, quantity of people at the expense of quality of life for each person. It's kind of like, like Thanos says in his whole speech that he gives, perfectly balanced as all things should be. Like, I mean, he's kind of right there. Like, I mean, it's weird to see like a speech from a Marvel movie as something profound, but in that particular case, yes. Like, he had a very good point there. Like, I mean, if there's fewer people, you have better conditions for each person. So it's kind of like RK selection. It's like, do you want more people but with a worse quality of life for each, or fewer people but with a higher quality of life for each. And obviously, people say, yeah, but to have a high quality of life, you need economic growth. And to have economic growth, you need population growth. Again, as so many times I point to the example of Japan, like, okay, maybe they don't have economic growth like we do, but they've been able to sustain a relatively decent quality of life. And I mean, obviously, yes, Japan has its issues. Like, my main issue with them is their workaholic culture. I think it's very unhealthy. But nonetheless, it's like, could they have, like, let's say, a work life balance similar to that of Western Europe, of like Northwestern Europe, but still maintain their quality of life? Maybe they could, or at least close to it, even with a declining population and without mass immigration. So, I mean, I do think it's possible. It may not be easy, but I think it's possible, and I think it might be easier than trying to maintain our quality of life with an indefinitely growing population. And I mean, our population is growing. Like, Canada's population growth is, I believe, about the same rate as the global population growth. And that's almost entirely due to immigration. Like, we're not reproducing at a replacement level. It's immigration that's driving this. And it's causing, our roads are overcrowded. Our public transit, I mean, our public transit is just kind of non-existent, but where it does exist, it does get overcrowded too. And just our healthcare system is a complete mess. It's totally overburdened. It's just getting to be a disaster here, especially not just in the really big cities, but even in like the mid-sized cities in Ontario or British Columbia, for instance. It's getting to be that way. And again, some people say, yeah, the problems are because it's immigrants, but I kind of disagree, because it's like, even if it was, us reproducing ourselves, like the old stock Canadian white population, we would still potentially be facing some of the same problems. Not all of the same problems, but some of them. Like the traffic jams, yes. The healthcare system being overburdened, likely yes. Also, okay, you know what's one big problem? As many people pointed out, part of the reason why there were so many ugly buildings that were built in like the 50s and 60s and so much historic architecture destroyed was, at least in some cases, to accommodate the growing population. It's like, hey, if you have quick, sudden population growth, it's hard to build nice looking buildings. It's easier to just whip together a bunch of quickly built ugly buildings. And it's like, hey, that's another reason, that great argument against unchecked population growth there. Do we want to live in a society where everything is ugly, quickly built, cheaply built, because you have this exploding population? Again, that's probably part of the reason why so many third world countries don't have their architecture very well preserved, because, like, aside from like the monumental like temples and palaces, like that's one thing I've noticed from what I've seen of a lot of third world countries, is like the monumental buildings will be preserved, but then the regular buildings won't be. And I think part of that is just population growth, like slapping together all these new buildings that are bigger and can accommodate more people. So yeah, fundamentally, I think with the overpopulation issue, it's about quantity versus quality. Quantity of people versus quality of life for each person. And to some extent, quality of people themselves, because I think people have more of a chance to flourish and meet their full potential in a society that isn't overburdened by overpopulation. So yeah, I mean, honestly, again, I'm not saying there is a Goldilocks zone, like there is such a thing as underpopulation too, but frankly, I don't think that's an issue in most of the world right now. Like even Japan, like their population is declining, but frankly, they're overcrowded to begin with. They could use population decline. Um, Even a country like Italy, like they could use a little bit of population decline. They are kind of crowded. Frankly, like the only places where I'd say it might be a major concern is like some parts of Eastern Europe and Russia. But other than that, like for the vast majority of the world, I'd say like they don't have to worry about underpopulation. It's really overpopulation that is the main concern.